at grave sites. The grave of my grandmother noted by an unmarked white stone. In the places where people kneel, crouch, press up against a wall, tuck a note into a crack, light a thin taper. In school desks and blank notebooks and blackened falafel skillets. The scent of dampness held in a windowsill. The small pouches hand-stitched with yellow petals. The mess. You can make all the chaos you want and pretend the wall is keeping you safe. You may be cruel or pious. You may not carry a weapon into any heaven ever described by any religion. But know that peace is patiently hovering inside of everything and will not belong to anyone and never has. And someday, someone wiser will welcome it again. And what a day that will be. And Rabbi Nachman's prayer. May it be your will, Holy One, our God, our ancestors' God, that you erase war and bloodshed from the world, and in its place draw down a great and glorious peace, so that nation shall not lift up sword against nation. Neither shall they learn war anymore. Rather, may all the inhabitants of the earth recognize and deeply know this great truth, that we have not come into this world for strife and division, nor for hatred and rage, nor provocation and bloodshed. We have come here only to encounter you, eternally blessed one. And so we ask your compassion upon us. Raise up by us what is written. I shall place peace upon the earth, and you shall lie down safe and undisturbed, and I shall banish evil beasts from the earth, and the sword shall not pass through your land. But let justice come in waves like water, and righteousness flow like a river. For the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Holy One, as the waters cover the sea. Amen.
Thank you, Mindy. And thank you, everyone, for coming and joining us for this conversation. Thank you especially to Debbie for joining us online today. I think this is a first for me, friends, to have someone zooming in and us being here and also live streaming. So I can't pretend to understand everything that's going on right now, but our tech team does. So I just want to say thank you so much to our tech team for making this incredible feat possible. Friends, whether you are here in the sanctuary or joining us online, I want to say thank you so much for joining us for this important conversation. This is an important one. It's a timely one, and so we're grateful to be able to have it together. This fall, our focus in our formation hour has been unlearning Christian nationalism. And one of the big insights that we have gained is that unlearning something as big as Christian nationalism doesn't just happen through theory or critique. It happens through proximity, through getting close to real people and real stories and the real human experiences beneath the headlines and the slogans. And I want to say that that's true for our topic today as well. When we talk about Israel and Palestine and the war in Gaza, it's easy to stay at the macro level. The scope is vast, the roots go back millennia, the layers are complex, the suffering is immense. And it can feel overwhelming, impossible to grasp, impossible to heal. But as I hope that we have learned this fall in our conversations, if we're willing to get close, to trace and sit with the stories, I believe that we might begin to see these issues of power and belonging, identity and faith, fear and hope aren't as foreign as we might think. That this story isn't as far from our own as we might imagine, and that the way through this intractable conflict in Israel and Palestine might also touch much closer to home than we might imagine. And so I want to be really clear at the outset that today's gathering isn't a comprehensive lecture or a political analysis. We are not here to arbitrate, or certainly not to solve or settle anything, but instead to better see, to listen deeply, to draw near. This is a family conversation that we're having, and so it felt only appropriate to invite a member of our extended church family to come and join us for it. Someone whose own story intersects with this region in a really profound way, and that could help us enter into this space with wisdom and heart and humility. And many of you know and love the Reverend Debbie Whaley. She served as a pastor here at First Pres Berkeley for 10 years and now serves as the lead pastor at Mount Washington Presbyterian Church in Cincinnati. And over the years, Debbie has led countless pilgrimages to the Holy Land, introducing people to the birthplace of their faith, while also building deep, decades-long friendships with Israelis and Palestinians alike there and here. Debbie doesn't come to us as a self-expressed expert, but instead as a guide, and a wonderful guide at that. A trusted pastor and a friend, sharing what she's learned through the years of walking with people she loves in a region of the world she loves. This wisdom that she brings today is born of real relationships and long faithfulness in a place where both are hard-won. So today we're going to spend just a little bit, about 50 minutes, in conversation with Debbie. And as we talk, I invite you to jot down questions as they come to you. There are note cards on the ends of each pews. Feel free to just write down what's coming up for you, questions that you have, and then we will gather those towards the end of our time together and leave a generous amount of time for some Q&A with Debbie. Debbie, we are truly so grateful to have you with us. Thank you. It is a delight, and I didn't want to go on too long with my introduction of you because I want you to tell us, in your own words, your own story. So I wonder, to start us off, for those of you who don't know you, can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you became invested in this part of the world? Thank you.
I would love to. First, let me say I'm so excited to be with the First Pres community. You are a beloved part of my own formation. I was a parishioner there, and then was called to ministry, and then was privileged to serve. So my connections to First Pres go back to my, oh my goodness, my early 20s. So I am so grateful to be with all of you. You have been a part of my own formation and my own deepening walk with Jesus, and how Jesus loves the vulnerable and the lost throughout the world. In terms of where I am, I just thought I'd let you know so you can gloat a little. I'm sitting all wrapped in blankets because it's 37 degrees outside here in Cincinnati, so I'm having a longing seeing you guys not dressed in winter parkas as you're in the sanctuary, but look like what I remember of California, that nice, lovely, mild fall weather. But when it comes to Palestine, about 15 years ago, I went on my first trip to Israel, Palestine on a pilgrimage. It was sponsored by a seminary for pastors, and I really didn't know what I was seeing. I come from a background of being just an assumption of an acceptance of the state of Israel. I had Jewish friends growing up. We participated in Jewish rituals with our neighbors and family friends. And as an evangelical Christian, I was thrilled when the state of Israel was established and supported the state of Israel. But I really didn't know much about Palestinians at all, except that they were terrorists. From my perspective, they were the super mysterious Muslims. I think of the Olympics. I think of airliners being commandeered by Palestinian terrorists. And I didn't have a really positive experience or understanding of the complexities of the region. When I went there to the Holy Land for the first time, the majority of our time was spent in Israel proper. But I remember with fear the first time I entered into Bethlehem and crossed a checkpoint. We were boarded by Israeli soldiers with machine guns right next to our shoulders, and I wasn't sure what all this land was all about. So then why a year and a half later did I find myself living in that very same city of Bethlehem on the Palestinian side of the wall? And that's because of First Pres. We had a huge conference, a global conference that was looking at global issues. And as a pastor, I was asked to host Palestinian theologian Johanna Catenaccio. And in talking to Johanna about what little I had seen and the ignorance I had about the complexities of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I found myself more at a loss than enlightened. And Johanna actually broke categories for me. I didn't realize there could be Palestinian Arab Christians in this region. And so at that point, I began to listen and to learn, and that began my journey. When I lived in the West Bank, it was a very eye-opening experience. I've never lived as a minority population in a larger group. And so it was very interesting to be embedded in the Christian population there, as well as the Muslim population in Bethlehem, and to learn and listen. As a result, all over the years, I'm not going to go through all of my story, but I began to realize this was a very complex story, one that involved people, not just politics. And for me, my approach has always been to try and listen to the human story of the Israelis, the human story of the Palestinians, and the Palestinians both being Muslim and Christian, and allow God to speak within that framework of listening deeply, knowing people well, knowing people over time, and hearing about their trauma and their experiences of living in this very conflicted region. So that's sort of a little bit about my background of how I become more involved. Although I should say that my connections are very personal, especially on the Palestinian side. Not only have I led pilgrimages there, but I vacation often in Palestine, staying with people who are very close to me, who we are family together. So I am in twice a week, 3 times a week contact with Palestinian friends in Israel. So both the Arab Israelis as well as Palestinian Christians. So the connections run deep and very personal for me.
Debbie, before we get into what you're hearing and experiencing on the ground among Palestinians and Israelis about Gaza today, can you give us some kind of historical background on the differing narratives among Jewish Israelis, Arab Palestinians? As we were talking and getting ready for this, you were talking about the importance of narratives and how the stories are so different.
Mm-hmm. I think what's important when we think about this region is that, first of all, we think of history, and we want to know the facts. And the academic study of history and it's meant to be an objective science where the historian themselves stand outside. They're not stakeholders in the story that they're telling. And they're also very sensitive to issues of power. But when we talk about narrative, we talk about the stories that a group of people who have a common identity tell about themselves. And narrative, by its nature, is subjective. It sets up heroes and villains, and the protagonists or the heroes in the stories are always going to be the people who are telling that narrative. And so they are going to weight the facts of certain historical things differently and interpret them quite differently. And so for much of what we hear in the United States, and even in my experience of being in Israel and Palestine, are hearing 2 very different stories that Israeli Jewish people tell and how they frame their identity, but also how the Palestinians have a narrative and an interpretation of history and how they frame their understanding of historical events that have happened. So one of the challenging things about this region is that you have to listen deeply to both narratives before you point a finger at anyone and judge them, because they're very different. And when you hear and are inside of that narrative of the other, it gives you a capacity to have empathy. You may not have agreement, and you may disagree with how they have lived out that narrative, but at least it begins with an understanding of common humanity and our common hurt. And I should say before I say that I have my own narrative. I am a Christian, and I really hold the vision of Ephesians that says Christ came to break down the dividing wall between two peoples and to bring about peace in the midst of hostility. And so I have my own narrative and my own hopes for this region that really place Christ right in the middle of all that, and really have a belief and a hope that as Christians, we can have a voice, whether we're Palestinian Christians or Christians as part of the world, in entrusting and having hope in the midst of this incredible conflict. But with that said, let me just give you a little brief rundown. And of course, I'm going to tell you historical facts, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about how, in very broad terms, Israeli Jews or Jewish people might interpret Zionism and the land of Israel, and how Palestinians might respond to that. So the first thing that we need to know is that people will say this is a conflict that's been going on forever and ever and ever. Well, the modern day tensions between Jews and Arabs is actually a more recent conflict. The truth of the matter is that there are historic Jewish groups that have ties to the land, even though the Jewish people were largely exiled from the land in the first century. There has always been a continuous Jewish presence. At the same time, if you read the book of Acts, there were also Arabs that were also in this land as well. And so there has always been Arab presence in the land continuously since the times of Jesus. But it's important to remember that while Jewish is a religious and ethnic designation, Arab is a cultural designation. It is not a religious designation. In fact, only 1/4 of all the Muslims worldwide are Arabs. So to be an Arab does not equal being a Muslim. It is a cultural designation that speaks of sort of an Eastern point of view, a more collectivist society. It is also has a common language, overlaps to language, and a way of being in the world. So there has always been, the land has always had these groups within them, and you will hear in their narrative that they will diminish that presence depending upon which narrative they are a part of. So that's the first thing. And even the Jewish people that were in the ancient land of Palestine, as the Jewish identity and language of Aramaic sort of diminished, the Jews that lived in historic Palestine spoke Arabic and identified with Arab culture. And so up until the late or mid 19th century, Jews and Muslims and Christians all lived in that region and would have identified more with Arab culture, but would have designated and separated themselves into Jewish religion, Muslim religion, and Christian religion in the same region, but culturally saw themselves as all Arab. And in part, that was a contribution of the fact that for 400 years, the Ottoman Empire ruled in that part of the world. This is a different type of culture than the nation building colonial projects that happened in Europe. And so while they were occupied by the Ottoman Empire, the idea of colonialism or empire building was different in that region of the world than it was in Europe and in the United States. Fast forward, 19th century. As we all know, if we know anything about history, Jewish people have not been treated well, even particularly by the Christians throughout history. In the late 19th century, many secular Jews were exhausted and tired of being persecuted for being Jewish. There was a very strong anti-Semitic threads that ran through especially Western societies. And as a result, the idea of Zionism became something that secular Jewish people grabbed a hold of. And this was the concept that the Jewish people should have an opportunity for self-determination and be able to create a space where they could be protected from these virulent anti-Semitic waves that would go through, especially in Europe. And a man named Theodor Herzl really popularized this concept. But at the same time that Jewish secular thought is thinking about a place to go, and in the early days, they just wanted anywhere. They actually considered places like Alaska. They considered places in Africa to locate this Zionist movement. At the same time, there were Christians in Britain who saw the coming of Christ dependent upon whether the Jews repopulated the land. And it was partly through the Christian influence of this season that the Zionist movement began to attach a place of self-determination and protection to the physical land of Israel. And in fact, in some of the early Christian speeches that were done at this time, this is where this phrase began: there is a people without a land. They should go to this land that has no people. So sort of in the Britain, remember Britain in the late 19th century is still a colonial power. They have of the mindset that they can go and take this land and give it to whoever they want. And there was a strong combination of Christians who were trying to bring about the second coming of Christ that then partnered with these secular Zionists to really bring sort of a religious element to modern day Zionism. Fast forward to 1917, the end of the World War. The Ottoman Empire has been deposed, and this part of the world is all being separated and carved up by Britain and France. And in this, they give this historic area of Palestine to the Brits to sort of administer. And the promises that the Brits exacted from the Arab leaders, who are more tribal and family-oriented than nation-state building at this moment, was that if they helped them overthrow the Ottomans, that they would offer them autonomy in this region. And it's in this area that you see the establishment of countries that are well known to us, like Jordan and Syria and Lebanon and Iraq. And so, but this one little area in this mandated area of Palestine was problematic, because at the same time that they were carving up the land, the British Home Secretary, his name is Lord Balfour, issued a statement that Britain should provide a homeland for the Jewish people in this historic area of Palestine. So we now have a conflict. Arab leaders have been told that if they cooperate with Britain, they will receive autonomy in this land and be able to have their own self-determination. At the same time, Britain has offered a homeland to the Jewish people, who at this point don't own or purchase the land. There's a small presence, but as a group and a migration. And this is what begins the conflict in 1918 between Arabs and Jews, where I'm not saying there wasn't conflict before, but this is where it becomes very heightened. Because Britain in this season, from 1918 to 1948, breaks numerous promises on both sides. It's like a seesaw, back and forth. The Arabs get mad and really mad, and then the Brits sort of capitulate to their concerns. And then the Jewish leadership gets really angry, and they capitulate to some of the demands of the Jewish leadership. And then this attacking of both sides. In this period, the Jews are attacking the Brits, the Palestinians or the Arabs are attacking the Brits, and they're attacking each other. And there is just so much conflict. And frankly, Great Britain has done a number on the whole region. It's just a mess. World War II happened. And we all know the Holocaust now leaves not just a need for protection against anti-Semitism, but we have one of the most horrific genocides that has ever happened in our history. And it's, where are they going to go? And there becomes a collective guilt in Europe, but that guilt is not enough for them to want to welcome the traumatized Jewish refugees from the Holocaust. And you have this Balfour Declaration, you have this land of Palestine, and the Brits don't know what to do. And so they turn this region and decisions about this region over to the UN. And the UN is a new organization. Just to give you an idea of what it was like at that point, in 1948, as we have the war ending and we have now this UN trying to figure out what to do with this land that we would call sort of historic Palestine or current or modern day Israel today. As it sits in the statistics, 67% of the population is Arab, and 33% of the population is Jewish. Over the years before 1948, the Jewish population went from 6 to 33% because of the massive immigration that the Brits allowed during this season. This felt very threatening to the Arabs, as you might imagine. Suddenly their country and their identity is being overrun. At the time of the 1948 partition plan from the UN, only just 5 to 6% of the land was owned by the 33% of that Jewish population, and almost 95% of the land was owned by the Arab population. So just picture that for a moment. 95% of the land and 67% of the population is Arab, 33% of the population and only 5% of the land is owned by Jewish landowners. The partition plan then breaks up all this land, and it suggests that they should transfer 43% of Arab owned land to Jews. This upsets the Arabs tremendously. Why should we give up 43% of our land that we have historic ties to the Jewish people? And in the Arab narrative at this point, their thoughts are, why should we give up our land? Why should we solve a European Jewish problem? We didn't have anything to do with the Holocaust, so why are we expected to solve this problem on our backs and with our land and economically give up rights to what culturally and socially is, which I could talk about for hours, but I won't right now, their connection to the land. So in this partition plan is rejected by the Arabs, but is embraced by the Israelis, because after all, they're going to increase their land ownership in this plan by 43%. And it's a very good deal in this sense. There's also in this, I'm not going to go into it, but there's a transfer of population as well as land. So a certain percentage of Jewish people would be displaced from their land, and a certain percentage of Arab people would be displaced from their land, as well as this land swap that was going to happen. At the end of the Arab-Israeli War, which just to give you an idea of how they say it differently, the Israelis call it the War of Independence. The Palestinians call it the Nakba, or the catastrophe. At this point, Jewish ownership before the war had gone from 5.5% ownership to 85.5% of the land became Jewish owned. They went from 33% of the population to 82% of the population. About 40%, 45% of the Arabs were displaced in the Arab-Israeli War, and that equals about 750,000 people were forced to flee, who were not allowed back into Israel proper now when the state was established. Of the 750, there were about 150,000 Arabs that were not displaced by the war, who remained in Israel proper, and who we would call today Arab Israelis, or Arab people of Arab cultural background and identity, who are now Israeli citizens. But it's much more complex than what I just said, but that'll, I think, suit us for that. If we want to go ahead and we want to look, we have the 1967 war, and this is when we start using the language of occupation. That 1967, we have another war with the Arab neighbors, and those Arab neighbors lose that war, and at that point, Israel takes over military occupation of the West Bank, which had previously been under Jordanian control, and of Gaza at that moment. And so since 1967, the Palestinian territories have been under military rule and military occupation. There's some other things that happened just briefly. We have the Oslo Accords, which you may be aware of, that creates a possibility under the Clinton administration that there's a possibility that there may be a path forward to a two-state solution. That was supposed to be a 5-year temporary plan, and the rubrics of Oslo in 1993 are still in place. Palestinians do not feel like they were treated fairly, and so there were 2 intifadas, which were uprisings against the Israeli occupation. And then obviously in 2023, Hamas attacked Israel on October 7th in a way that was horrific, and a loss of life of almost 1,200 people in that attack. But there had been attacks and counterattacks all along the way, which we can talk about a little bit later. The basic construct of Zionism is that even what started off as a secular movement began to take on religious overtones, in particular, in part because of the support of evangelical Christians in Britain and around the world, saying that the land had been promised to Israel, and therefore they had a divine right to the land. They say that because they've had continuous presence in the land, even though it was a small minority, that is enough to justify their presence and their occupation of this land, or whichever word you want, their establishment of the state of Israel. And that in that establishment of a state, it is perfectly adequate and expected that this would be a Jewish state, even though it's a democratic state, that its primary character is shaped by its Jewish and religious identity, not as a race or even as an ethnic identity. And there are many things that I could say about that. But in the early days of Zionism, and even in the Balfour Declaration, there was a commitment to the Arab neighbors. But as Israel began to establish a common identity, they used some of the tools that were common in colonialism to establish a strong sense of identity in the land. On the other side, the Arabs say the land was confiscated from them, they were forced to flee, and they were never allowed back into the country at their home and heart. And so this is sort of where these two narratives sort of sit. I know that was long, I know that was probably complicated, but that's about the best I can do when I don't have 3 hours to explain this. I'll turn it back over to you guys.
Yes, thank you. Debbie has taught I think you said it was like 9-hour seminar around this, and we've talked about, could we maybe make that available? So there are conversations if you want to do a deeper dive and unpack all that was just offered to us. But I think what you've illustrated so beautifully for us, Debbie, is that even within this history, there is clear differing status of power at play within this history, as well as then beginning to unpack the language, even how some of these key events are told and retold. And so could you help us unpack the narratives then, how these stories tell, or how these communities tell the stories of the events that you just unpacked for us?
So I would say within the Jewish Israeli framework, and I want to be really clear that the Jewish people are a broad and diverse group. So it makes me a little uncomfortable to say Jewish people feel this way, or even that all Israelis feel this way or perceive it this way, because Judaism and the state of Israel are not the same. They are distinct. The state of Israel is a political state government. Judaism is a faith, and there's broad expressions of that. Just as there are a broad array of Islamic understandings of faith and a wide range of commitments and efforts towards peacemaking and other things within the Islamic faith, and oftentimes these are the two primary groups that get pitted against each other, right? There's Jews and there's Muslims. It's not quite accurate in this area, but for the broader understanding, that's often how this is. When you think about the language, and this gets played out in how we even read our news, when we hear about Jerusalem, they talk about Jerusalem being the divine right. This is the city for all time that God has deemed the capital of the Jewish people. But we need to remember that Jerusalem also holds high place of visibility and sacredness in Islam. And so even what we call the platform, where we would say the Old Testament Christian temple, it's called the Temple Mount when the Israeli Jews refer to it, or Jewish worldwide refer to it. But when Arabs refer to it, they refer to it by its Arab religious name, which is Haram al-Sharif. So even the language that dominates the conversation, we're talking about the same geographical place, matters to the people involved. If you were to call it by its Arab name in an Israeli context, that would be seen as an extremely political act, and actually an act of aggression against Israel. But to call the Temple Mount among Muslim people, and it is to suggest a diminishment and a marginalization of their religious background. So even locations matter in all of this. We see things like the right of return. You may have heard about that, and you hear that all these refugees, these 750 refugees who went to places in the West Bank, Jordan, Egypt, Lebanon, and Syria primarily, you may think, oh, okay, these refugees, like, why don't they just get on with it? But the UN promised very early on, as they were establishing their guidelines for how countries that have been at war should be at peace, civilian refugees are entitled to return to their land after the conflict ends. And so one of the great platforms and one of the big sticking points of the Palestinian-Israeli cause is that the Palestinians want to return to their homes, except that those villages have been destroyed, those homes in that land has been repurposed. But a symbol of that Palestinian hope is that many Palestinians hold the keys to the homes that they left in 1948. And you go into almost any Palestinian home that's a refugee home, whether they're refugees in the United States or not, and they will show you the old brass key that they have. They want to be able to go home and open the door of the old home that they have and believe that is their right. And by human rights standards, that would be true. On the Israeli side, the right of return is not offered to Palestinians. It is offered only to Jewish people around the world. And so if you are a Jew, secular or religious, from anywhere in the world, you have the right to make aliyah. You have the right to return to Israel, where Israel will support you and give you education and language and help you find a job to establish yourself in Israel, a land that you may not have any physical continuity or ancient, except for that religious claim of Zionism, connection to the land. So again, to an Israeli, of course, we're trying to build a Jewish state. We give privilege to the right of return to Jewish people. Palestinian people do not have that right. So again, the same word of return, one is offered the opportunity, another is not. One feels like it is the development and the gift of the state of Israel, to another it's the ostracization, or how do you say that word, or marginalization. They are not seen as worthy of that. So that's just one example. To give you another example, we have heard a lot about the hostages since October 7th. And those 200 people that were taken by Hamas in that horrible terrorist attack in southern Lebanon and southern Israel on October 7th, they took people and they were hostages. However, you would never hear what Israel has done by taking people in Gaza, some of whom had no connection to the war or no expressed violent expressions or tendencies, including physicians and leaders and others, were taken into Israel as prisoners. And so a prisoner sounds like someone who did something wrong and they are now incarcerated for that wrong. A hostage is someone who is seen as innocent. Now, I'm not saying that all the prisoners in the Israeli prisons were innocent, but there were many people that have been swept up in these that were in no way responsible or supportive of the violence that Hamas brought against the state of Israel. But the language matters. Another example is what we would call violence in the West Bank that's happening. It's increased incredibly since October 7th. And that was by a group of people, Israeli settlers. Settlers are people that are living within the West Bank proper, who have the support of the Israeli government with infrastructure and other things. They're actually under Israeli law and under the military occupation that their Palestinian neighbors are under. But the settlers have done very violent acts, including burning down villages, uprooting trees. There's been violence of destroying homes, and there have been cases of violence and murder. And maybe the ones that make our news are the ones when American citizens have been killed, of which there have been many. We call that in our press settler violence. But if a Palestinian were to attack an Israeli Jew, it would be a terrorist act. And so again, this is just the way that we use language. One is far more inflammatory. A terrorist is a far more inflammatory term than just saying settler violence. And there's all sorts of things behind all of that, and how, like a Palestinian who would act in a violent way, it's an affront to the Jewish people. It's very heightened, but an attack of Jewish settlers against Palestinian farmers or Palestinian villages is not actually even condemned by often is not condemned by the Israeli government and rarely investigated as a hate crime by the Israeli government. So those are just some of the kinds of things that happen. Even things like they call the wall differently. In Israel, they call it the security wall. In Palestine, they call it the apartheid wall. So all of these things are interesting in how they talk about their narrative. You will rarely find an Israeli who will say that that this was a genocide in Gaza. They will be reluctant to talk about it's an apartheid system. And they will say that Israel was not a colonial project, even though it has similarities to those kinds of terms that are used globally, because it's not a precise one-on-one. But in the West Bank and by Palestinians, you definitely hear people using, and very early on, use the words of genocide, use the words of this is an apartheid state, and that the establishment of the State of Israel was a colonial project. And that is meant as a pejorative term, not as a positive thing. So how they talk about even what's happened in the last 2 years is quite different.
We've been looking at Christian nationalism here in our Unlearning Christian Nationalism class, and we know that you've been thinking a lot about that and talking about that in Cincinnati as well. Can you talk about the recent rise of right-wing Jewish nationalism and how the U.S. Christian community is often involved in supporting Israel politically and otherwise? And I mean, I was thinking about, as you were talking about the image of a settler, I was kind of fascinated to think about how that term plays vis-a-vis American history and our sort of popular image of a settler as being someone looking for the frontier and so forth, as if this is sort of land without any peoples, right? Which we know is not actually true. So how does Christian support in the United States figure into this whole mix?
So when we think about Christian Zionism, is what it's often called in the United States, it has a disproportionate influence on Israeli policy, both inside Israel and in United States policy. Many people might think that it's the Jewish bloc or political bloc or voting bloc in America that impacts U.S. policy on Israel, but that's not true. A Christian evangelical perspective on the state of Israel raises, millions and millions of dollars in support of the state of Israel. And by sheer population, sheer numbers, they outnumber the Jewish population in the United States, in fact, the Jewish population worldwide. And so they are by far the most influential group of people that impact the American policy towards Israel. You may wonder why that is. So part of the rise of Jewish nationalism, which I mentioned, partnered with political Zionism back in the late 19th century, was because there is a movement that is seen that when all the Jews populate the land of Israel, that this will bring about the second coming of Christ. And so you will find Christian leaders leading tours of pilgrimages and they sit over the land of the ancient Jezreel Valley, where the city of Megiddo was. And this is where they believe the last battle of Christ coming again is going to take place. I heard one a Christian, evangelical Christian, say specifically these words: what will happen is, imagine that the armies of Iraq and Iran and Syria and Lebanon and Arab countries like Jordan and the Palestinians will amass massive armies across this area under a UN flag, and said, this is what the Bible tells us is going to happen. And I sat there and went, really, the Bible was that specific about all these armies are going to amass in this place? I was like, wow, you guys might have another addendum to Revelation that I haven't seen. I was so shocked, but saying this is where the final battle is going to happen, and that Christ is going to come in the middle of that and obliterate all these armies. And in that, the promise is that it will also obliterate the Jews that are there. So it's a very interesting marriage that Christian evangelicals have with the state of Israel. So they believe that it should exist, but it exists to eventually be destroyed to make way for the kingdom of God in this futuristic sense that they believe will be centered in this land. So it's a very interesting movement, which is in part what the Christians in Palestine find so offensive. They're like, you're not even listening to us who live here. What exactly is Israel? What exactly is the definition of a Jew in the Bible, a biblical sense? The borders of the land are quite different depending upon where you are. How you define a Jewish person based on Jewish Israelite history really depends. You know, Jew is not a word that was used in the opening chapters of the Bible, right? This is a post-exilic understanding of the southern kingdom that becomes called Jews because they were from Judah, right? So, like the Samaritans, according to the original borders of Judaism and understanding, would have been considered Jewish, or would have been considered Israelite people before they have their own civil war and separations. So, and then the prophets are very clear that the true heart of the Israelite of the Jewish kingdoms will be based on obedience to God and a turn towards justice, which includes justice for those who are on the margins and the vulnerable. And so Christians in this region really want to make sure that we're not just defining these terms because they fit our political constructs. Does this sound like Christian nationalism? Yeah, so that it just supports a political point of view and really is not a biblical point of view, or it's consistent with certainly the values and teachings of Jesus. Now to go to the right side of Jewish nationalism. So the state of Israel has a bit of a challenge. I said at the beginning they wanted to establish a Jewish state for self-determination for Jews and also protection against the horrors of anti-Semitism that moves into all sorts of different types of behaviors and actions towards the Jewish people. But Israel also set itself up as a democracy. Democracies assume a certain amount of plurality, right? They're not homogeneous groups of people. And certainly our understanding of democracy in this country was that it was not tied to a religious ideology. So when we talk about with fear, sometimes we hear the words Islamic State and we get all upset and we think, oh, they want to impose Sharia law onto their political system. In essence, what's happening in Israel is that there's a rise of Jewish nationalism, religious Jewish nationalism, that wants to impose Jewish religious ideology onto all what we would consider state types of decisions. So just imagine in Israel, you cannot get married as a Jewish person except through the rabbinic courts, even if you are a secular Jewish person. And if you want to be divorced, it has to be granted according to Jewish law, biblical Jewish law. So Israel already has this tension between its secular movement and its religious movement and how that will work. But at the position of Jewish exclusionariness, like they have the exclusive rights to the land. They also, in their right-wing sort of rise of, it's also an understanding of superiority, that they are superior to the people. You will hear in the rhetoric currently in the current government of the State of Israel, things like calling Palestinian or Arab people dogs or inhumane. You'll hear them use generalizations about Gaza, that everybody in Gaza was responsible for Hamas. There's no innocence there. There's a big dehumanization, which comes at, we are the heroes, we are the superior ones, we are moral. You perhaps have heard the phrase that the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, are the most moral army in the whole entire world. I think some of the things we've seen in Gaza over the last 2 years would suggest that the Israeli Defense Forces cannot claim the highest moral ground anymore. But this is sort of the narrative, again, of who they are. So it's exclusive, it's superior, and they believe that they are exceptional. They are the only ones who have the exclusive right to the land. In that, and when we're talking about nationalism, there's always a way that we weaponize part of our ideology against other people. And you will see in the rhetoric in Israel that they weaponize the Holocaust and that trauma, and that I'm not going to diminish that trauma. It is a historic trauma that lives in the bones of the Israeli Jewish people as well as Jewish people around the world. It is a huge collective trauma and not to be diminished, but it gets weaponized, as then any criticism of the state of Israel is weaponized to be anti-Semitism, which is interesting because within the state of Israel itself, there is far more freedom among Jewish Israelis to criticize the state of Israel than there is sometimes in the United States to criticize the state of Israel. Now, on the other side of weaponization of a nationalistic movement, which the Palestinians have in their own way, is probably a weaponization of the Nakba and the claim of an ownership to land. As these generations are beginning to parse themselves out as time goes on, the newest generation of Arab Israelis, so these are Arab citizens of Israel who have Palestinian roots and identify with Arab culture, and even within the Christian circles, think it's ridiculous to keep demanding the right of return. They think that particular thing is bygone now. It's a bygone era. They're never going to be able to reclaim that, and instead are trying to claim another way of being in the land. But this is how these narratives get played. And so when we talk about that there's no partner for peace or whatever among each side, it's like this insistence that that the Palestinians will never ever make peace with Israel until they have the right to return to their land. It's I would say from my perspective that's impossible, which is why the two-state solution seems like a possibility, but it's becoming less viable day by day. Anyway, all that to say, there's something else about narrative that we have to be aware of as we're listening to all of this. When we talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we then often assume that those are two powerful groups that are of equal power, and it's not in this region. It is clear that the most powerful, and not just by a little, but exponentially more powerful in the region, militarily, politically, with global support, is the state of Israel. And any given group that holds power is going to control the perception of who they are and impose that perception not only on a group that has a different narrative, but is going to be able to broadcast that narrative more globally. As a result, the group that doesn't have power is always just fighting for the right to define the terms of the conversation. And between these two groups, the narratives are not weighted the same, globally or even within this region. Of course, the Palestinian narrative is weighted in Palestine, the Israeli narrative is weighted among Jewish Israelis. But globally, this also has an impact of how the Palestinian voice has often not been heard. I am not going to justify the terroristic attack on Hamas, by Hamas on the state of Israel. But if you had been listening closely, or someone like me who has lived in the West Bank and seen the destruction and the oppression of the government, the occupying forces of the state of Israel against the Palestinians, you would have empathy for their desire for resistance. They're called terrorists around the world, those who have tried to fight for any kind of Palestinian dignity or statehood, but they themselves would see themselves as standing on the side of justice and might use the word of freedom fighter. Again, the dominant group often defines the terms of how each group's narrative is interpreted within their context as well as globally. So I think that's part of the challenge. And just to give you, I think in white nationalism, you know, at the rise of it that we've seen in our country, it's a weaponization of grievance, right? That's how that movement has grown up, is they weaponized grievance against and used their Christianity to amplify that. The West Bank, they amplify and weaponize sort of a sense of pure justice, that they stand on the right moral side without very little empathy or understanding of the realities on the ground. And I would say on the Israeli side, they weaponize their trauma very much towards and the accusations of anti-Semitism in this conflict. Does that make sense, what I just said? Sort of how that gets weaponized?
Yeah.
It's hard that I can't see your faces to know if you're nodding or not, or looking like, oh, I just confused the heck out of you. So can I just tell you two stories real quick about that, guys? So I have a really good friend of mine. I love befriending the ordinary people. I'm not a big one who has toured the Knesset and know, although I do know some in all realms of the political realm, but I really love the ordinary person. And so I'm on the Sea of Galilee, and I have a really dear friend. He's an Israeli Jewish man who's a boat captain. And every day he just takes tourists out on the Sea of Galilee, and his name is Dory. And one day, Dory and I got talking. I talked my way on his boat through a whole funny story, but I won't go into it right now. Anyway, and we ended up sitting and talking for several hours and just wanted to listen. He doesn't know my background. He didn't know I'd lived in Palestine. I just wanted to hear what he thought of the conflict, which I ask that question a lot when I'm over there. And Dory talked about that and talked about his background. And his view is, he said, this place is my home, but nobody wants me here. And that's his narrative. He has a right to live here. This is his home, but none of his Arab neighbors, nobody in the world wants him to have that right to have home. And then I'll jump over to a baptism that I went to in Bethlehem, where this little amazing Palestinian Christian boy, in their tradition, they bring the child in for the first time after 40 days and bring the whole family. It's a big procession. And in this baptism, I watched at the after party or the reception afterwards how this baby was passed along among all the grandmas. And I mean, I don't know about you, but normally Americans are a little more circumspect about handing their babies over to people, even if they know them when they're that young. But this baby got passed along by everybody. And I finally asked, and I said, what's that all about, right? Like, it just seems like the celebration of this little boy is so intense and so personal. And they said, because our only hope is that he needs to have an identity that he's beloved by God. Because the rest of the world says he is not worthy to be called anything that brings self-esteem into his life. He will be called a terrorist just by where he was born. And we as Christians know that in these formative years, it's our responsibility to make sure he's beloved by God. Two very different responses to the narratives that they're part of. One that feels unwelcome in the region, and one that says, yes, he will be labeled, but we want him to know that he's beloved by God. And these are the kinds of stories that are worth listening to and trying to build bridges with.
Thank you. I do want to be mindful of our time, and if folks have to slip out, we certainly understand. But if you have been writing questions down, I invite you to send those to the center. Doug will start collecting those and trying to synthesize so we can at least get a few of your good questions to engage with Debbie on. But Debbie, we would like to hear a little bit more about Gaza specifically and its role in the story. And would you share a little bit about how the war there is impacting the region and how these two communities are framing the war and perhaps justifying the violence?
And if you have questions, raise your hand so that Doug can see you and come grab the card from you. See Vern down here in the front, Doug.
Gaza is a painful thing to talk about, to be honest, for me, as it is for people around the world. None of us have, well, in one sense, none of us, when we saw the pictures of what happened on October 7th at the various kibbutz and in Israel, were horrified by the bloodbath that we saw. And the retaliation for those of us who were part of the region, as soon as the news came through of October 7th, most of us who have any connection knew that Israel would retaliate and it would be prolonged and it would be devastating. I don't think anybody thought it would be as long as it was and as comprehensive as it has become. Within Gaza itself, you can, if you Google it or you look at any news report, you'll hear the stories of now mass starvation. Nearly 70,000 people have been killed, another 170,000 have been wounded. There's tens of thousands of people that are probably hidden under the rubble. Gaza itself was already called an open-air prison, and the UN had already said before the war that the viability of Gaza it's one of the most densely populated areas in the entire world, would not be viable in the next 10 years. Now you add the war where 90% of the housing has been destroyed, water and infrastructure have been completely destroyed. Before the war, you only had electricity for maybe 4 to 6 hours, and now all of those infrastructure systems are gone. Their health system has been obliterated. The education system has been demolished. And so you're talking about unexploded ordnance everywhere, and you're talking about tons and tons and tons and tons of toxic debris that is now everywhere on this place. The UN, I read a report yesterday that said less than 3% of the agricultural land in Gaza is arable and has suffered no damage, but something like only 30% of the land has any possibility of being able to grow food. And Gaza itself, before the war and currently, is blockaded on all sides, air, sea, and land. As someone who's been in the region, I've always wanted to visit Gaza, but it's nearly impossible to get permits to cross the border into Gaza unless you're before the war, part of humanitarian aid. It is a locked down state, and now even more so. The impact of the lack of aid and the aid blockade for food going into Gaza has meant a massive malnutrition, which is, all of us know, children who are malnourished are not going to thrive moving up. And there will be a radicalization backlash against Israel in Gaza. There is no way that they suffered this kind, and the younger people will not be radicalized against Israel. So it sets up, again, the conflict only intensifying, in my opinion. And but you have a community of a million people or millions of people who are shell-shocked by what has happened, who are powerless largely to affect much change, and are frankly just trying to survive in a very horrific environment. So Gaza has the hope for the Gazan people, and the outlook looks very bleak. And because I spoke about that power imbalance, even as there's been a ceasefire, as there have been things that Israel has disagreed with what's happened in Gaza, the snafus with the returning of hostage bodies, or where they couldn't establish DNA or whatever, or slight skirmishes, we're talking about Hamas or the Islamic terrorist groups within Israel and within Gaza do not have the firepower that any of their rockets or incursions may do much damage. That's why October 7th was such a shock to the Israeli people. The kibbutz is adjacent to Gaza, but they had never been ever even conceived that they could breach the security that Israel has set up. So it is a devastating situation in Gaza, and will require us not to look away and to lean into that suffering and be part of just, frankly, right now, basic humanitarian aid. But the cessation of the violence is not actual peace. And so the opportunities for creating peace or making peace or bringing peace into that region is a far more complex process. When you talk about the Israeli people and the Palestinian people, they have two things deeply in common with each other. And one is that when a Jewish person is hurt anywhere in the world, it's like the collective Jewish folks feel that tremor and that pain in their ecosystem of collective identity. And the same thing is true of the Palestinian people. If it happens to one, it happens to all. In that sense, both societies are very similar in that it's not as individualistic. It's a very collective sense of who they are that's very intertwined. And so as a result, the Palestinians that are in this country, who are refugees largely, in fact, you may be surprised that 63% of the Palestinians in the U.S. are Christian. They're Christian Palestinians from the historic places like Nazareth or Bethlehem. But they feel the pain of Gaza. The people in the West Bank feel the pain of Gaza. And because it's a relatively small community that is connected by historic family ties, I have never been on the phone with any of my Palestinian friends in the last 2 years that at some point in the conversation, I hear a story of how this person's cousin or this person's grandma or this person's fourth cousin 50 times removed, which to them is the same thing as being a first cousin in their culture. There has been a death and they are on the way to some sort of memorial service or ability to recognize a loss in Gaza. Even though they have never lived there, they feel that pain deeply. The impact on the region has meant that during the war, Israel has shut down the West Bank. It has been tolerant of more settler incursions and land grabs in the West Bank, and has turned a blind eye largely to the settler violence that has increased. Places like Bethlehem have been completely shut down economically because they depend on tourism. The borders and the checkpoints have not been open. An example, whose son is in his first year of college, to make his 45-minute drive to his college in Abu Dis, which is behind the wall in what used to be Jerusalem, it can take him up to 2 hours because of negotiating the checkpoints. And he never knows whether or not the checkpoint is even going to be open or active. And when he is stopped, it means his car and his person is searched. So in that region, it's difficult. So that's a little bit about Gaza and how it's impacted the region.
Wow, thank you. We've got about 5 minutes, which is not enough time. So I'm just going to do one question here for you that I think probably is shared by many of us in the room, which is the so what question. So what do we do? What suggestions do you have for us in terms of getting involved, getting engaged, understanding what we're seeing in the media, responding to Christian nationalism and the narratives here that are telling us about ways to interpret what's happening? How do we as Christians as you're leading your congregation, what do we do from this place, individually and as a community?
Well, the first thing I think what Michelle said at the very beginning, it's an invitation to listen and be near to the people that are involved. And I would say that it's very likely that you have Jewish people in your life, and I would not go to lecture them or tell them they're wrong, but just to go listen and listen to the Jewish narrative and try and get inside what it's like to be a Jewish person in this environment, how they feel about the state of Israel. Some would be very supportive and some wouldn't be, but to listen. Yes, I would say so, listening. The other thing is you probably know Palestinians as well. It may be the guy who pulls your espresso at the local coffee shop. And you probably can have a clue if he's Palestinian because he may have a picture of the Dome of the Rock behind his coffee shop. All you need to do is ask a few questions. Tell me, I'm curious, do you have connection to Palestine? And you will hear a story. I think it's really important to listen to the narratives. Listen to the Christian narrative, listen to the Muslim narrative, listen to Jewish narrative, listen to the Israeli narrative. And I would say I probably should include the Christian nationalist narrative, but I don't think they're the primary players. And I also think that one of the things that I am inspired by young Christian Palestinian theologians that are emerging now out of Israel and Palestine. For many, many years, Christian theologians were more liberation theologians and really wanted to only speak of justice. And being recognized as a minority in the narrative world, they wanted at least their right to say they had been wronged. But the new wave of young Christian Palestinian theologians, of which I gave a bibliography to these guys, actually are saying the failure of peace is a failure of imagination, and saying that what we really need to do is reclaim the kingdom of God in this place and believe that Christians can be the bridge between these opposing groups and that love and grace is possible. Their vision for this region is not simply coexistence, but actual living together and thriving together. And they bring that imaginative worldview from their reading of Scripture and following Jesus. And this one theologian, John Munayer, who's a friend of mine, I know his family, and I just heard him speak last week. And he tells the story that after October 7th, there was a death threat put on his family, a family member. And so the family met together to decide whether or not they had to-go bags, whether or not they should stay or whether they should leave. And their decision as a family was that their job is to be a witness and to keep bringing this vision for the kingdom of God where all people can thrive and be loved and experience God's grace is what they're called to do, and that is their mission, even at the cost of their lives. I think that sort of creative commitment to the kingdom of God by these brave and upcoming Christian theologians is something we need to listen to. It's the same hope that we need in this country, frankly, to not give in to despair, and their hope is really centered on the life and teachings and the vision that Jesus gave us for the kingdom of God. And I would say that is one of the things to get involved. If you want to get involved on a practical level, there's a bazillion organizations. The Red Cross is credible in Gaza. There are Palestinian organizations. The Shepherd Society out in the West Bank has been very significant in these. The World Kitchen is another one if you're interested in the feeding. There are places to be involved, but on a local level, I would say befriend some people, listen to their stories, and begin to read and listen and learn.
Thank you, Debbie, for helping us listen and learn today. This was just a part of the much larger conversation to be had. And as Debbie mentioned, she did put together a beautiful bibliography. There are hard copies at the back in the narthex there, so I invite you to pick that up. And we can also circulate it in the Unlearning Christian Nationalism listserv. But I just want to say, Debbie, thank you for being a guide to us.
I love you all. I really honestly wish I could be there in person just to give you a great big hug. So thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
I think
Really
there's a
an
bunch
honor.
of people in the room that would like to have you come in person and keep talking with us. So.
I'm happy to do that. I think it would be incredible. The one thing I didn't mention was about 2 years ago, I started right as before October 7th evolved, a graduate level program in peacemaking in the Palestinian context. So I have a whole other shtick that has to do with understanding peacemaking in this context, which I'm very interested in, but it's been very hard to execute in the last 2 years to actually live into that invitation.
Well, let's all give Debbie one last round of applause. Debbie, it's so good to see you. This has meant a lot to me personally, as you were so important in my early days at the church. And I also want to give a quick shout out to Mindy Creason, because this was actually Mindy's idea, and she planted it for Michelle and me, or the three of us kind of, and I just immediately thought that's what we got to do. So thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Debbie. We hope to be in more conversation soon.
Yes, my love to all of you.
Love you. Take good care.
Shalom and assalamu alaikum. So.
Thank you.